Hello, everyone. So we have a short agenda, but some interesting stuff today. We want to discuss what we're calling the Istio Coddle structural idiom, meaning what order do the commands work. We want to talk about version compatibility between the CLI and the control plane. We want to talk about the operator. Yeah, if we have the operator folks here. I know Stephen couldn't make it. And I have a demo of Istio Coddle Inspect, which I hope to get into 1.3 and want to get everyone's feedback on. Do we have anything else we need for this meeting? Anything else we need to add to the agenda? So because people have been doing the proposals sort of willy-nilly, I know I've been guilty of this, the ordering of the subcommands has been an issue here. So do we want to be like Kubernetes with sort of the command, verb, noun, like vagrant, command, noun, verb, or like OpenStack, command, category, noun, verb. So I've taken all the feedback that I've got on the various work items and put them into this issue. So Lewis was the first one who really suggested that we pay serious attention to this. And he called out the way Docker works, Docker images, vagrant, kube control. I also took a look at the Martin's operator was proposing. So the operator is proposing Istio Coddle, and then this category manifest, and then sort of a verb. And possibly this is a noun, or maybe it's a category, I'm unsure. So manifest versions, manifest generate, apply, migrate, and then profile list, profile dump, and profile diff. Then Jason has a proposal for the multi-cluster operator, which has these commands, and these are scarily close to the operator commands. So there's a mesh generate, similar to the manifest generate, and then there's profile generate, similar to, then there's the mesh generate. These are all very similar. So we need to be serious about sort of how we want to structure these things so that people can find what they're looking for and that they don't step on each other's subcommands. Does anyone have any opinions on this topic? Okay, well, maybe we can vote or something in the issue. Please visit the issue, tell me what your favorite thing is and if it's important to you, and then we will try to deal with it.
Hey, Ed, once we reach a consensus on the structure, would we migrate any of the existing available commands?
So many of the commands, so first, migrating is a huge pain, especially for the things that are not in experimental. And because people have scripted them and they're used to typing them. And we should have to keep them around for a few versions. We can put them in a new place and have them in both places. Most of the commands we have now are kind of one-offs, kube inject or something. I mean, we could have called it manifest kube inject or YAML kube inject or kube inject YAML. So in a sense, they're one-offs and we don't need to fix them. But if we're going to be adding dozens of commands, especially for these operators, we need to be serious about the new ones.
Okay, that makes sense. There's just like a couple in there that, if we go like the category approach, then people would kind of expect them to be inside that particular category.
Right. So So maybe we want to make the categories and then put the commands in as aliases, and so they're available in both places. That might help people get familiar with the new location. I also have an unrelated request from Len, who's not here today, about the experimental commands being hard to find. If something has, people can't remember if something's experimental or not. So the idea was, she proposed that if you try to operate an experimental command and you're not using experimental, it would sort of say, do you want to re-enter this with experimental, to sort of give you a hint that you're almost there, you almost got it, but you forgot the word experimental. So maybe we need aliases for a few of the commands, especially during this transition to a more rigorous way of organizing things.
Yeah, I agree. I think aliases would help.
The next agenda item is the control plane version. And I think on the environments call last week, several people asked me to write up sort of a straw man for this. So let me see if I can bring it up. Why is it not opening? Oh, Google Docs encountered an error. Okay, well, reloading helped. Okay, so the motivating example is that some of the commands, like proxy config, fail if invoked on newer sidecars and newer Envoy versions than they were meant for. We also had a problem with the Istio Coddle version with the remote option because the control plane switched to doing JSON instead of the format it had been doing, and the older command lines didn't work. So the idea was, instead of failing with the mysterious message, we should have some rules to check what the version is. And I just threw out some rules sort of out of the top of my head, approximate rules. You know, if you're so far ahead or behind, warn the user, and if you're on a completely different version like Istio 0.7, just use and halt. So this is the proposal. There seems to be a lot of comments on it right now. And if you have thoughts on this, give some comments. For people who are concerned about performance, the suggestion has been, instead of doing the slow way that the Istio Coddle version command does, asking the control plane what version it's on, we're going to try to get the control plane version from the sidecar injector config map. The sidecar injector config map has sort of kept some stuff about the install. It has a global tag that could be used if you have an official release. There's some talk in the comments about what should happen for daily builds. As part of this work, I went through all of the existing Istio Coddle subcommands and reported their connection to either Kubernetes or the Istio control plane. So authn talks to pilots authentication, deregister talks to Kubernetes, etc. So this might give a hint as to which commands need to have this feature. The Istio Coddle version is sort of the worst one of all, because it not only does it talk to control plane, it talks to every pod in the control plane and specific path names. So you renamed a binary in your control plane, it would stop working. So that's the story there. Any thoughts, folks? I don't want to just give a summary of what I've been doing lately. Let's hear from everyone.
Well, I really appreciate just having that list visible so that the problem has a face. So thank you for putting that together. I'm not sure if you can see your phone.
Okay. So make comments in the document, anyone who's got an opinion on this, and we can try to decide if we need this for 1.3 or if it should be rolled out in 1.3.1 or something. We have the operator CLI reference. Martin, are you on this call? No. Well, since the last call, everyone has approved this document, and this is the command line for the operator. At least we think it's supposed to be. And there had been some talk about making a standalone binary, but probably we're going to roll it into Istio Coddle. The commands themselves seem somewhat strange to me, or at least they seemed strange when I first read through it. So to figure out what you can install, what versions of Istio are possible, there's this idea of manifest versions, that it's fetching from some server on the internet to figure out which versions are available. There's this manifest generate, which generates Kubernetes manifest to install Istio with. And the whole thing, on first reading, troubled me from a user interface point of view. So typically a user installs Istio once and then they upgrade it maybe forever. At least in my model, they have a long-lived cluster and they're upgrading it sort of the way I do. So I imagine that there would be commands like Istio Coddle install, Istio Coddle, Istio upgrade. But these are sort of more building blocks. And it looks like this is what's going into 1.3. If we need higher level commands that do this work, we're going to have to squeeze it in later. So something like manifest apply is supposed to go out and generate this manifest and then apply it. So essentially this is your upgrade. But it's unclear. There was some pushback when I said that we should call this Istio Coddle, Istio reinstall or upgrade.
So the semantics for this, the desired semantics for this command are that it is both install and upgrade. That we wanted to model, we didn't want to treat them differently. It's kind of analogous to kubectl apply. You don't necessarily care whether the resource or set of resources exists before or after, but that the tool or the controller would do the right thing and kind of handle both. So with that in mind, we picked apply. I think Sven at one point suggested make it so, which said we don't care what previous state we had, just.
I actually, after reading this a bunch of times before approving it, and I was hesitant, like these commands. I think these commands are logical for sort of us and sort of for advanced users. The feedback that I kept giving was that there should be a sort of a syntactic sugar alias where Istio Coddle install was maybe just this manifest apply for the latest version, and Istio Coddle upgrade was just check if there isn't existing control plane resource and fall out if it isn't, and if there is, reinstall a new version using that old control plane resource or something. I mean, I feel like it shouldn't be hard to make some aliases for common install and upgrade, but if it is hard for some technical reason, we can put it off until the next version. This is still better than what we have now. Right. I mean, time's a wasting. There was a note on Discuss that we have to sign up for 1.3 testing, so we can't really blue sky it for any more time. It's been approved. We got to make it go. But think about if there's any ways that we can create aliases that look more like something a newbie tire kicker would use.
So this is Sven here. I think that's actually a great idea we should consider it in the context of when we have the controller as well, sort of, is the default install run with the controller, or is it just the CLI mode? I think the CLI mode was originally kind of envisioned more as an advanced user thing anyway, but we should figure out how we want that to fit in.
In all cases, although the CLI is the advanced user thing, having some simpler things make it easier to learn sort of how to use the controller and stuff. Anyway, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I meant like if we had Istio controller install, what would it do, right? Would it install the controller, or would it just install the manifest? So I think we'd have to hash that out. That's all I'm saying. Because I don't know which is considered the easier option.
Right. Well,
but yeah,
so,
having that sounds useful, and some sort of just upgrade it to the latest, and maybe hopefully it would give you some feedback on what it would actually do, and then ask you if it's okay. But could definitely do that. Right.
So maybe there's options for having it work via a controller or doing it to work on its own. I don't know.
Yeah, we could ask the user too. Yeah. But yeah, let's take that up in the context of 1.4. I think we are past the point of no return on 1.3 a little bit.
I gotcha. So I wanted to give a demo, but I was expecting that this first stuff would take about 40 minutes. Do we want to see the demo now, or do we have anything else that we should work on?
I got in a little late. What was the outcome of that first discussion on the structured idiom feedback?
The outcome of this was strangely that no one had any input. That I laid out in this issue not only all of the comments from the documents, but all of the proposals, both from the operator CLI and from the multi-cluster operator CLI, showed how they're too similar, showed the different stuff, and I encourage people to come to the issue and vote. And my hope is that if we like one way or the other, it'll be easy to fix anything we put into Istio Coddle. So if we put a bunch of commands in for 1.3 daily builds, we can just reverse them if we decide that some are the same.
Okay, I can go take a look at that. We should, just as a general feedback, we should take some of these notes we should take in the agenda doc if we can. Put notes about any discussion we had on some of these things, just so we remind people to go vote would be useful. Now let's see a demo.
I proposed at several meetings ago this Istio Coddle Inspect, and the feedback was that I should make sure that it used Envoy's configuration, and people weren't sure if they wanted to sign off on it or not, so I just went ahead and implemented it because it's going to be useful for me whether or not it goes into Istio or not. And I have it as a PR, which is yet to be reviewed, but if it was reviewed, it might go in. So don't review it positively unless you like it. So this is a tool that I designed because I was people who were confused about why their Istio didn't work. And often it had to do with they had left they had old rules left around from previous Istio versions, or they had typos or mistakes in their Istio stuff. And I thought about how I might sort of solve that and make it more visible. I wanted to make something sort of like kube control describe, but for the Istio rules. Hopefully we'll have kube control describe for the Istio rules based on some of the custom CRD, open API stuff, but this is more of a peek into Envoy and really tell you if which rules are connected to your pod before sort of going. So for this tutorial, which will become the blog article if we get this into 1.3, currently it's just in a private repo of mine. I've already deployed book info. I got book info running, and if I go here and we can see that it's the standard book info before you've done anything. And what I'm going to do is look up my ratings pod and call this Istio Coddle Experimental Inspect pod. So when I do that, it tells me which ports are exposed by the pod and which container exposed them, which people find interesting, and it's hard to see that with the current stuff. It tells you which Kubernetes services are connected to it just by listing the Kubernetes services and using the match function. And but it also tells you which Istio protocol is being used. And it calls pilot, asks for debug authentications, and it reports what the pod is doing, that it's doing permissive, which I print this way. I don't print permissive. I don't know which is better. But then clients will be talking like this. So very simple information because there's no other rules yet for that. If I apply the destination rules and do it again, the same information comes up, but this time it tells me the name of my destination rule and what host that destination rule is sort of controlling. And then it tells me something that nothing else does. It tells me which subsets match just by calling the Go client subset label matching function. And then
That's super useful. That's really cool.
It prints out which other subsets are there. And it tells you what the traffic policy is. So very simple, not interesting at all. Yes?
Ed, this is Neeraj here. So I was the one who had suggested if we can use the breadcrumbs from Envoy configuration, it will be really useful for this tool. This information is great. I was just curious if you were able to use the breadcrumbs, or did you have to go to some other source to get all this great data?
Yes. So I'm using the breadcrumbs for the destination rule. I'm not using the breadcrumbs for this. I'm asking pilot. I would, and that's because there was no breadcrumbs for policy authentication.
What about the earlier one where you are specifying the service ratings, port, blah, blah, blah? How does that happen?
So when I print out, this information here is coming from Kubernetes, just by doing a get. And this information is coming from, or this part is coming from Kubernetes by doing a get on the service, and we match it. So the service itself, I'm not getting from the breadcrumbs. I'm calling match on that explicitly and recreating it. So I couldn't, the service comes from ad hoc logic of mine. I wish it was better.
So I think maybe inspecting the Kubernetes configuration is okay for this, but if you're going to inspect Istio configuration outside of Envoy, then we will have two places where there's logic to figure out what Istio configuration maps to a particular workload. That could be dangerous.
So you're right, but it turns out that actually, because we're following the breadcrumbs, we're getting pretty correct information about which destination rules are connected. And you actually, though, I'll have some comments on this later, because the user is not only interested in which rules are being used, they're also interested in which rules aren't being used, but feel like they should be. And I have a demo of that you'll see on this demo explaining that problem. So hold that thought because it's completely right. We applied that. We now see the subsets. Now we're going to apply the virtual services. So it made the virtual services, and I'm going to take a look at the reviews 1 pod instead of ratings this time. So we get the same stuff that we saw before, but we get one additional piece which says there's one HTTP route. We've got a virtual service as part of talking to this pod, and we have a one HTTP route on that service. So that's pretty nice. That's not useful at all, but at least things are rocking. But now let's take a look at it for the V2 pod. So with the V2 pod, we sort of, from the breadcrumbs, we got that the reviews virtual service was there. But then from my ad hoc logic, we got this pod's not going to get any communication. There's a route to some other subset, but no route to the subset for the pod that we're asking about, the V2 pod. So this is right now a great tool to let you know, like, why is my pod not getting any traffic?
So, okay, so there is still this information is great, but possibly there's an issue where if the logic for that in pilot changes, this will go stale. Is that fair? Because it's your ad hoc logic?
That is fair. So one of my thoughts about how to implement this was to like bring in a great deal of pilot, and I still think that might be better than following the breadcrumbs. So rather than asking Envoy to actually have pilot pull all the configuration, pilot running in memory on your client, and build XDS, and then sort of look for any errors or things that happened when building it. But some of this stuff, like no destinations match, is going to be hard to check because pilot doesn't give you any logic for that. The weird thing about this tool is that it runs backwards. So pilot is very big on how does traffic get to the right pod, and this is trying to do that backwards.
So Oz has a PR floating around for was it cross-resource analysis or multi-resource analysis, which I think does some of this. It's not focused on the pod, but it would point out if you had a gateway, a virtual service that was bound to a gateway, but the gateway didn't exist, or a virtual service that referenced a destination role, but the destination role didn't exist, that those get analyzed in Galley and then possibly reflected back into the CRD status.
Yes.
Which might be compatible with this in some way.
I looked at that PR. It's a big PR. I liked it. I'm really hoping that can get into 1.3 because everybody's clamoring for it. I think it would be great. And it may be that when it may be that that's good enough that we don't need all of this tool. Some of this tool is going to be needed because I think I'm going to show examples of configuration that's correct, but still is confusing. So
Ed, if we think about the scope of this command, is the idea that this command tells you for a workload what Istio configuration is getting applied, and also which Istio configuration which you think should get applied but it is not? Because the second one is useful, but it's kind of a big thing to do.
So you're right. I wanted yes. Essentially, the first thing is extremely important. What configuration is applied, and then printing it nicely, I think, is also important. If this tool just printed out the names of the virtual services that are applied, it would be less exciting. So whether it, an earlier version of the PR actually did a list on all virtual services and all destination roles, and then called pilot to match the hosts. And I still think that I might want to bring that back. So this current PR is 1,000 lines of code, and it doesn't. I got rid of that feature on Srirem's request. So the idea is, pilot has this great function to match if a host name matches a service. I could just call that, and then I could subtract the things that Envoy has versus the things that match but aren't there. So things like wildcards, or if there's two destination rules or virtual services for the same host, Oz's thing will detect that if it gets merged. But let's say there are two destination rules for the same host. I think the user wants to see this destination rule took it, this one is not being used because pilot had to throw it away. So I think that's going to be valuable. But I'll go with feedback. Maybe I can put an initial version in 1.3, and then we can talk about making it bigger or smaller.
I think sorry, go ahead.
I think you differentiate the experiences from the implementation. That might help, because I think there's fewer people that would object to the experience. I think everybody said this is really useful. What I've heard so far is more on the implementation side, that either maybe there's some common code or common logic that can be shared between this and Galley, or you could use parts of Galley, and that may change over time as these features are merged in.
This will share a lot of code with pilot to be because Galley is mostly doing currently just a single resource validation. Even when it does multiple resource validations, the actual configuration that gets deployed to Envoy still lives in pilot. So,
right. So suppose there were two destination rules for the same host. Hopefully, Oz's work will put in the status field some warning like, by the way, this is in conflict with this other one, and one has been accepted by pilot and one hasn't. But anyway, I'm going to show you some more features of this, and then we can discuss sort of how I did it and if I did it wrong. Anyway, I just showed how no pods match this subset. So suppose I'm an operator. I found out my traffic got screwed up because I applied the wrong thing. So now I'm going to delete that configuration. And after deleting it, if I go back to the browser, everything should be fine, but it isn't. I screwed something up, and now I don't know what I screwed up. So I'm going to rerun that same command, reviews v2, which had shown me that nothing was going to happen. And now it's giving me a very different warning, route to unknown subset. As you can see, there's no destination rule here naming the subsets, and that's because while we were talking, I deleted the Istio configuration. I had meant to delete the virtual service. I accidentally deleted the destination rules. So this tool is supposed to tell you that. You sort of have run the command and sort of figure out that you did that, and then you just sort of maybe know now enough to fix it, and then it becomes easy, things are working again. So the other features that I put in this tool was some MTLS stuff. So I'm going to apply strictness for this. And after I apply strictness, I'm going to show that it's strict. So right away it says clients are going to speak MTLS and the pod is going to enforce MTLS. And this just uses the pilot's debug authentications API. It's the same as the current Istio Coddle Authn, but Istio Coddle Authn lists everything. This just lists it for the pod that we're on, so maybe it's easier. But let's show what happens if there's a mistake. So when you apply book info the first time, Frank has written stuff that says, well, look, you got to use the right destination rule. If you screw it up, nothing's going to work. So suppose I had applied the wrong destination rule, and I had given not the MTLS one, but the non-MTLS one. Now, when I inspect that ratings pod, instead of it saying client uses MTLS and the other, it's giving me this warning. Again, it's the same debug authentications that you see from Istio Coddle often, but it's just on a single pod, which made it easier. But it also sort of reports the destination rule and the authentication policy that are in conflict to sort of help you. And this is where I'm going to ask for sort of user-facing advice from Ram and others. I'm reporting something very tiny here, or a destination rule ratings/default. Maybe that should be ratings.default or default.ratings. But should it say sort of, newbie stuff explaining what's happened, or should it just report something small like this? What does the community think?
Is there a way to use like a verbose flag or something along those lines that might enable someone to drill down into problems that are being reported?
Yes. You think it should be flag and default verbose or default narrow?
Well, I guess that's one question I have about this, and that is, who's the desired caller here? Is this a CLI tool that is used interactively by a human user reading the results? Or is this a program that is called automatically and whose results are acted upon automatically and parsed?
Right. So at one point I had tried to structure this maybe with an output of JSON, like optional JSON output, where it would just list the destination rules and virtual services that are being evolved, and you could use it that way. I felt that the common use case that I get are people who just don't know what to do, don't know why the pods aren't working. So I thought the default experience should be like at this level. What went wrong? Something succinct enough that it easily fits on a page, but has these capital warnings if something is wrong, and that if we got feedback that people wanted something scriptable, we could have it output in JSON or YAML what it's doing.
I think one thing that would be interesting is to be able to run it more globally without pointing at a particular pod and trying to find everything that's wrong in one shot.
Well, that's great, because I actually have a, I'll jump ahead. I've actually been running it on the entire cluster. So I run it with this little loop here, which could be a script. Just sort of says, get all my namespaces, get all my pods in namespace, and ignore unmeshed. And if I do that, oops, copied wrong. It will actually go through sort of every pod and report the things that it finds on the whole mesh. So Istio recommends or demands that any ports on a service be exposed by the container. Here's a flaw. It isn't. My Echo service didn't expose anything on its container. The TLS conflict we saw. So this thing works nice. It's also really good at finding, and I think I show that later. Like if the Envoy sidecar doesn't start or something. And these problems have gone away with the merge of correct handling of periods and pod names. So while that's running, let me show you the other things that that the tool does. It will inspect. It'll warn you if your pod has no sidecar. It will it will give you information, slightly more details, but less details than you get from your YAML. So something like Coddle described does. If I've applied a 90-10 rule, it sort of says your weight is 90. If I deploy some header-specific routing, it sort of says that this pod, or nothing's going to match v1, but v2 will be matched for these headers, and v3 will be matched for everything else. So that's all pretty simple.
I have a follow-up question. Mitch asked who the expected audience of this command was, whether it was kind of one extreme of a quick demo, or a user just getting started, or a more advanced user who would be scripting on top of this. And you'd also, I think you said a few times that this is kind of analogous to kubectl describe, that where people might parse the output of kubectl describe to figure something out about their workloads. One thing I've heard from the Kubernetes team is that that is a problem because essentially the output of kubectl describe becomes an API, and they have to deal with backwards compatibility.
Agreed. So when
I
script, I use kubectl inspect minus YAML. I would want something like that for this. The version I'm showing here is the sort of initial version for checking your configuration. But if people wanted something machine readable, because remember, in a sense, what this is doing is summarizing what your Envoy configuration is. And I've tried several times to summarize Envoy configuration, which is hard, and then it just prints out the CRDs. So
something to think about in terms of if you had to deal with backwards compatibility, it would just take a lot longer to prototype a lot of this stuff, I think. Whereas if you say we just limit the scope to quick summary, and then you need to go look further someplace else, then at least for a while you don't have to deal with backwards compatibility.
Right. I mean, the way it's designed right now, it's targeting a human user trying to debug. It's a debug tool to figure out when something is not working as expected. It currently doesn't have what you need to build automated scripting. It doesn't have JSON output and everything. So can we take an iterative approach and target the human user first and see how it can extend so we can do additional scripting abilities later?
Yep. I agree with that, and this tool looks amazing. Leaving the implementation specifics aside, can you paste a link to it? You said it's in your private branch or something, so we can start using it.
This tutorial is my private branch. The code itself, to actually play with it yourself, has a PR, and I will show you how to get that. So it's got marked XSL, so no one has reviewed it. But if you just do this, you can build it locally and try it out on your own stuff. It's super handy, and hopefully it's easy enough to use. And if you want that demo, I'll mail it to you. So while I was working on it, I told you guys before that my first version, the Shriram did not like the implementation of. Look at all of the destination rules and virtual services, and you sort of want that, in my opinion. Even though these don't affect traffic at all, and Pilot isn't going to put them into Envoy, Pilot does not put any breadcrumbs into Envoy about destination rules that match, but it threw away. So start default or 2 entries for the same host name. It's going to put the most specific one in, and your other ones aren't going to be there, and you're never going to know why unless a tool like this looks at all of the destination rules, or Pilot puts into Envoy additional metadata about rejected runners-up to be the destination rule and virtual service. The other thing I wanted to put into this was output of your sidecar. So many people, including me, get confused about sidecars. And there's no sidecar examples in the samples directory. There's tests for it, and I wrote my own book info sidecar to put product page in a little sandbox so it couldn't talk to anybody but who it was supposed to. And I think, and I made a work item for that. I don't want to put any stuff in this tool to show you what a sidecar looks like until I've seen some good sidecars. The only sidecars I've seen have been testing ones. No samples, no best practices. So that's for the future. I want to put policy in. I mean, the policy authentication CRD output. But I wasn't sure if, but we don't put a breadcrumb for it into the Envoy config. I wasn't sure if I should try to get it out of pilots, debug authentications, and then try to read it. But maybe in the future I want to show that. I also have been thinking that we want to be able to apply a tool like this not just to pods, but if you wanted to inspect your virtual services or destination rules, maybe I would love a tool that lists which destination rules and virtual services are not consumed by any pods, like which ones are just sitting around unused, and whether that went out to all the pods or did a match. There should be some way to sort of say, look, here's a destination rule, nobody's using it. And also, all these commands seemed like they would be nice if applied to a service entry or a Kubernetes service without the pod stuff. So none of the stuff about subsets would be involved, but just sort of showing what the Kubernetes service can expect. And of course, that means I couldn't use the technique of asking an Envoy what it's got, but Pilot can generate the configuration for a pod. So it would be great if I could just sort of say, Pilot, pretend there was a pod named foo, tell me if it could talk to this particular external host, and then it would figure out what the rules are for the service entry.
I think detaching from the live pod is a good idea because it opens up the possibility of running the same logic on a bunch of local config files rather than a live cluster.
Exactly. But to do that, I had a work item open for an issue open for a long time, requesting what I called command line pilot that would just read in YAML files instead of live Kubernetes resources and just sort of produce handy things like give me an XDS for a pod named foo if I had these YAMLs in my cache. That item didn't get any attention, so people, I think, put a thumbs up on it. I didn't implement it myself, but I still think for an advanced debugging tool that another implementation strategy is to bring up a local pilot with some local configuration and ask it Oracle-type questions.
Interesting, yeah.
I mean, that also takes care of having the code base being in one place rather than having multiple copies.
Ed, looking at what's happening in the chat right now, this looks awesome, and it seems like there's broad consensus that we must have very soon the sort of functionality that you're demonstrating here. My concern is that we seem to have implemented that functionality. Some people have put a little bit of it in Kiali. Some of it lives in Istio Vet from the Aspen Mesh team and Niraj. There's Inspect here. Oz has a slightly different take on it. I'm worried that if we come up with 5 different systems, you'll have 5 different sets of rules that give you 5 inconsistent results when inspecting a given cluster. I'm wondering if maybe it wouldn't be worthwhile to look at each of these and see how we can maybe unite around a common shared library code base or something along those lines for consistency's sake.
So I agree, and by putting this in Istio Coddle, I'm sort of trying to privilege my own implementation, which is not what I'm trying to do over at Istio Vet, which I use.
So I can speak for the Istio wet piece, I think I was waiting for Oz's framework put in where we can do things like cross resource validation as part of Istio itself. Where that lives, I don't know currently. It's like Oz plan is to reflect those as part of status of CRDs. It might also be part of Istio CTL, which is fine. And then we can move the logic of some of the logic of Istio wet inside it if you want.
Yeah, if you look at Oz's PR, it actually works both in a flavor that runs in the live cluster and just on local files using the same underlying logic.
I see. And okay, so if we want to start making a catalog of these validators, I'm very open to moving some of the Istio wet stuff inside.
And to PRs for Istio Coddle to do vetting, I want to get something in sooner than later, something really small to get people started. I don't want to introduce a lot of technical debt, like if people demand a certain use to it, but it would be great if 1.3 had something in it, whether it's this or Istio vet or.
Yeah, I think I agree that we should, definitely interested in delivering this in 1.3 so that we can get feedback from users. We could try to scope this down to see if that helps get it out the door. It sounded like when you talked about just doing what is applied to a particular pod, and that itself is useful, but there was no major issues with that. It's when the tool was trying to determine what you intended to apply, that's when I saw a lot of concerns from users. What if we just did what is applied and then release that as an experimental feature in 1.3?
So the current code only shows what's applied. It does it by scraping the Envoy configuration and the results of pilot debug authentications, and it just prints out my summary of stuff. The only thing that it does that's at all complicated is the printing of the subsets, which could be removed if there was objection to it.
Yeah, I think from like the debugging user experience, I think we need the underlying implementation detail on the overlap between all the other stuff that we have that's doing config validation and config statuses. I think those could be re-architected to build on one another. But as a debug tool, I think we do need this.
So the reason I did a lot of work on the subsets was because the unmatched subset problem, I expect Oz's tool is going to pick up. If you refer to a subset that doesn't exist, it should tell you on the CRD for the virtual service. But if your pod isn't a member of one of the subsets that's in the virtual service, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a pod that no one talks to. So I thought that it's worth considering, keeping this sort of ad hoc subset stuff in, because it makes it super easy to see the subset stuff, which so many people get wrong, and not understanding that they need to define them all.
Oh, hey, Ed, the experimental namespace that you've got this kind of in the pull request, we're essentially signaling to users that this is not necessarily a reliable long-term interface with that, right?
Correct. It'll as long as it's an experimental, it's going to change and break, and it won't have a reliable output until experimental is out of it.
Well, in that sense, then maybe it makes sense to push this in 1.3. This will generate, it'll be useful to people who don't have a tool currently, or who haven't discovered the additional tools that they could install to do this. It'll generate a lot of conversation around how these things should work, and buy us a full quarter to really talk about long-term how we bring these tools together and make sure that we're covering all of the desired use cases and architectural constraints, etc.
Yeah, agree.
So that's consistent with what we've done on the operator as well. So all the new operator type commands that we're integrating into Istio Coddle are under experimental. We know they will exist in some form, but the specific syntax is not locked down. Maybe we can do a better job of making that clear to users when they use experimental. Because I think there's some experimental commands that have been around for a year. So either maybe we need to promote those or refactor them based on this recategorization effort that I just talked about.
Regarding promoting experimental, Lynn has asked me, and there's a work item right now to decide if we should promote anything on this version. I think certainly Convert Ingress and Dashboard, although it's new, have been proposed as being promoted.
Yeah, I guess my point is, if it's experimental, should be clear that this is subject to change. We've just kind of overloaded that over time. But if we can take it back to its original intent, then
maybe just something in the release notes that says, no, really, we mean it experimental.
We really, and so bold with a banner, moving text, both for this and maybe for the operator. I think that's, for both reasons, we can get early feedback, but we're not locked into something, and we can still change it.
But these are purely client-side tools, right? They require nothing from the live cluster, which means that even if it's not technically part of the release, there are options to get in people's hand and have them run it against potentially older clusters.
I think so do you mean, you're saying that you don't need to call something experimental because it's a client-side tool?
I'm saying if we don't have time to get something in 1.3 or change it, there is still opportunities to get the tool out for people to try on all the clusters.
We really don't have an out-of-band release process for Istio Coddle. It ships on Istio's release train today, and I don't think I've heard anything from the test and release group about changing that.
So what I'm hearing is that I should try to get this into 1.3 as experimental, no promises, get feedback, and see if I can make it use more of core Istio features in the future so that it does as little as possible on its own. I'm going to try to make that happen. If it turns out that this does not get merged, then I will throw it in the Istio ecosystem and let people experiment with it there. I hope that doesn't happen.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. Please add your ideas for the next meeting, which is in 2 weeks, to the agenda. And have a good day, everyone.
Thanks for the demo.
Thank you. Bye.